All right, cool. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is building open source web apps without fear. If this wasn't the talk you were intending to see, you're welcome to step out. I'll also preface that this is going to be a talk that mainly focuses on the lessons I've learned over the past more years than I would like to admit building web apps. It's not going to be incredibly technical. It's more going to be advice for thinking about building web apps and deploying web apps and some considerations you might make in the entire world of putting things online. If that doesn't sound interesting to you, again, you know, you're not going to offend me. Go find something that's interesting to you. There's lots of great talks here. So hi, my name is Philip James. I'm a senior software engineer at Eventbrite in San Francisco. We totally are hiring. If people are looking for work, feel free to come talk to me. We're hiring people who build web apps, especially in Python. I work in Python. We're also hiring system administrators, and if you're a MySQL DBA, boy, do we want to talk to you. I've been working at Eventbrite for about 4 years, and I've been building Python web apps for 6-ish years. And so Eventbrite stack is, but I've also built things in a whole bunch of other tools that we're going to talk about a little bit more as we go through this talk. So for a bit of background, why web apps? I'm hoping that everyone here has some interest in building web apps. Otherwise, you know, you could go be watching some other talk. The reason that I build web apps is web apps are my hammer. There's kind of this phrase that you may or may not have heard of. If all you know is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Web apps are my hammer. They are what I know best. If I'm encountered with a problem of sufficient complexity and it needs an interface or some way of interacting with it, I'm probably going to turn to building a web application for solving that problem, especially if it's user-facing. And I may even turn to web apps as the interface for more complex applications that even sit on the desktop. We're in a world where things like Electron exist, where there are tons of tools for packaging what we would normally think of as a web application into something that runs on the desktop. And so I continue building things on the web because I know that that skill set is really portable and I can build a lot of things with it. But I also know that there's some things that web apps aren't great for. They're my hammer. They may not be your hammer. So another reason that I build web apps is that there's no gatekeepers. So I mean, I work on a production web app at Eventbrite, and that lives on the web. But if I want to build something for a personal project, which we're actually going to talk about as part of this talk, I don't need to get approval from an app store. I don't need to submit it to a package repository and go through a process there. I just get some server space somewhere, deploy it, and people can start using it. So there are no gatekeepers. The reasons I say ish there is because for people who have built products, you probably know that the hardest thing in any product is getting people to actually use it. And there are often gatekeepers, whether they are real gatekeepers or technological gatekeepers, that are a block between users and your product on the internet. So the thing that I love about web apps is no one is going to tell me, no, you can't publish that web app on a server. The thing that I dislike about web apps, which is related to this, is there's no great discovery mechanism, right? I have to buy ads, or I have to spread it through word of mouth, or I have to find some other portal, and there are gatekeepers there. So, also, gatekeepers have a ton of tooling. There is, I think, more tooling for building web apps than for building just about any other kind of application that we have right now, including tooling built into the technologies that we use every day. Every browser that we use has some sort of tooling built in for helping you build web apps, whether that's network request inspectors, or style inspectors, or DOM manipulators. So there's just this massive wealth of tooling that doesn't exist if you were, say, building an Android app or building an iOS app. The level of tooling isn't there. But there's also a bunch of tools for like frameworks and actually building the backend code for the web app. I mean, I work in Django, but if I'm a Python guy, I could also work in Flask, or I could work in Pyramid, or maybe I'm a Ruby developer, so I want to work in Rails. Actually, maybe I want to work in Drupal. Oh, no, I want to check out this new Node.js thing, so I'm going to work in Happy or Express, or it's endless, right? These are just the ones that I could think of off the top of my head of tools that we have for building web apps that make life easier. So I build web apps. If you look at my GitHub, you'll see that most of my GitHub is things built to be put onto the web in some fashion. Using web technology, I've built things like team management apps, card games. Funny story, a friend said to me a couple years ago, hey, I don't own a version of Cards Against Humanity. You don't own a version of Cards Against Humanity. Obviously, the easiest thing to do here will be to build a version of Cards Against Humanity in Django. That is how engineers solve problems poorly, by the way. We did this. It was running for a while. It's no longer running right now. I may be resurrecting it over the next couple weeks, actually, in a different form. But this is where my mind flows. Like, I have a problem. Obviously, the great way to solve it is to build a web app for it. I've also built news aggregators. I built a web app that's still running that will look at somebody's Twitter feed and pull all the interesting links out of it, so you can see like a condensed link version of all of your Twitter. And the app that we're going to be talking about the most for this talk is I built a contact manager, specifically this contact manager. And so I built this thing called ContactOtter, and ContactOtter came out of my experiences at conferences like this one, where I love going to conferences. I go to way more conferences than is healthy in any given year. And what I would notice is I would come out of these conferences, and often I would have like names and emails scribbled on paper, or I'd have this fat stack of business cards, and I'd be like, great, I'm making connections. But then a couple months after that, I would go and I would go, wait, I have this fat stack of business cards. How do I know these people? And so I had this sense that there are these amazing people at conferences that I wanted to follow up with, but when I went back, I had no context for who these people were. So there was an actual need for a tool that wasn't as complicated as like Salesforce or some other brand name CRM thing, to have a contact manager with logging, the ability to say, I met this person here, I emailed them here, and just kind of keep a rolling tab of how I knew a person. At the same time, I realized that there wasn't any great solutions for shared contact managers. If my wife and I have a large social network that we kind of want to have in one place, and we want to be able to say when we search for someone in our contact manager, hey, who knows this person best? How do we know this person? So that we can have use our social network more meaningfully, and it's not owned by Facebook or LinkedIn or any of those weird social media companies. So yeah, I built ContactOtter. It's a Django web app. It is a shared contact manager with logging, and I've been building it for about 2 years. I've only really gotten serious about it in the past year, but it's kind of been on the back burner in the back of my mind for a while. That link I put up, it is live, and we'll talk about how it's live in a little bit. You can totally sign up because it's a closed alpha. Your sign-up will have to be approved by me. If this project sounds interesting to you, I would love to talk more about it. I could go on at length about what I want it to be, because it's a personal project. Who here can't talk for hours about their personal projects, right? It looks something like this with names blurred out. I think it's neat, but I built it. You don't have to think it's neat. That's fine. Go build your own thing. And so, but this is a web app, right? It's not something that I'm shipping. Because again, going back to that no gatekeepers thing, there's not really an end product that somebody downloads per se. It's running on a server. And so when you're building software that's running on a server, you end up with a lot of fears. At least I do when I'm building products. I have a lot of fears about building web apps and putting them online. Some of the my top list of fears are fear of not having fun, fear of someone stealing my idea, fear of users hating it, fear of disappointment with myself, fear of unknown crashes, fear of deployment being a huge pain. Right, this is just the shorter list, right? Like if we were to collaborate as a room, I'm sure we could come up with dozens of fears around having software and deploying it out into the world. This seemed an appropriate place to use this. Oh, hey, that actually animated. That's so cool. Yeah, great. So, deploying software is full of fear. I have some bad news. Only some of these fears can be fixed with more software or for software management techniques. There are some human problems that just kind of have to remain human problems, and there's not much we can do about that. So some fears, like the fear of disappointment, that's just something you're going to have to reconcile with yourself. I wish I had good advice there. My advice there might be, if you get disappointed, learn lessons and move on to the next thing. Yeah. Fear of users hating it or not using it. This one matters more if you're actually trying to get other people to use it. From my point of view, I think ContactOtter is both great and a complete piece of crap. It's great because I am really proud that I've built this thing. It does what it wants to do, but it's a complete piece of crap in comparison to everything that I want it to do. And I know that I can't be disappointing all my users because some of my users are me and I feel pretty great about it. But I might want to have other users. And the way you solve disappointing other users, again, isn't a technology problem. That's go out, find users, have them use the software, see what they hate about it, and then fix it. I've made that sound really easy. That's actually really difficult, but you can't solve that with software, so I'm making it seem easy so we can go on with this talk. And as for the feel of users stealing your idea, well, we're talking about open source web apps. You can't steal open source. You're giving it to the world with proper licensing and attribution. And so if somebody wants to copy it and run it, great. That's what you put it out there for. There is a related fear that says you could put it out there, they could start their own hosted version, and then start selling it to other users and making the money that you think might belong to you. That's way outside the scope of this talk, but we should talk about that afterwards if you're curious to learn more. And that's one that that's a fear that I still live with. Like, well, I want to commit to open source. I have put ContactOtter out there in the world for people to use. I would prefer they use it through my official solutions and potentially give me some money someday. But if they want to run their own hosted version and charge other users for it, I can't stop them. That's just open source. However, there are 3 fears that we can solve with technology. Fear of deploying being a huge pain, solvable with technology. Fear of unknown crashes, solvable with technology. Fear of not having fun is partially solvable with technology. That's why that one's at the end. So let's start with number 1. Fear of deploying being a huge pain. This is one of the biggest ones for me. I am not an ops guy, and I'm not making any money from ContactOtter to hire an ops guy, and time I'm spending doing ops is time I'm not spending on features or bug fixes. So my deployments need to be fast and reliable and developer friendly. And when you're getting started with an open source web app, or really any web app, and you start thinking about how do I reduce the fear of deploying, one of the biggest questions you're going to have to ask yourself is, where am I hosting? There are tons of options out there. We're going to kind of run through the major flavors, and I'm trying to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each. And then at the end of this little segment, we'll talk about what ContactOtter does, and I'll go into why I chose those to help me reduce that fear of deployments being a huge pain. So there's the collection I call the traditional favorites. These are all often sometimes called IaaS providers, or infrastructure as a service. This is like as close to the bare metal as you can get without actually running your own server or running something in a colo. The big one is obviously Amazon Web Services. I'm sure you are interacting with Amazon Web Services every day you use the internet. Rackspace is kind of another popular provider. Those two both provide like big grown-up, we are full infrastructure as a services companies. And then there are the kind of, you might call them like hobbyist level or more traditional VM providers, which is DigitalOcean and Linode. I have used the providers on the left-hand side of this chart. Things that I like about Amazon Web Services, you can build any kind of setup you wish to build in Amazon Web Services, as far as I can tell. Like, there are probably some very super special select setups that you can't build with Amazon Web Services, but they want to own the entire internet, so they're going to try to do everything in their power to make sure that your setup can be ported to their platform. What you give over in terms of that is you have to make your setup kind of work in their infrastructure, and their docs are not beginner friendly. When I talk about ContactOtter would have to like hire a full-time ops person, what I mean is if I ever actually want to move on to AWS, I should probably hire a full-time ops person. Rackspace is in many ways more open source friendly. They do a lot of support for open source deployment strategies, but I put them in a similar bucket to Amazon Web Services because I think they put themselves in a similar bucket to Amazon Web Services. And DigitalOcean and Linode, what you're getting there is you are paying, in DigitalOcean's case, $5 a month for their cheapest VM, and they say, great, here's a VM, we've installed Ubuntu on it, here's a root password, Don't complain if it blows up because it belongs to you. And Linode is pretty much the same. I use DigitalOcean over Linode entirely because I got a coupon code for DigitalOcean and then saw that they were cheaper than Linode. And I was like, this sounds great. I like not paying money. I'm going to keep with DigitalOcean. As far as I can tell, it is truly and honestly a personal choice whether you choose DigitalOcean or Linode. There might be some pricing differences. They are functionally identical. Pick whichever flavor you like better if you're going to go with VM-based hosting solutions. Okay, so that's the infrastructure as a service providers. That's a bit too close to ops for me to be comfortable. I'm a developer. I want to reduce the fear of deployments. This all feels like ops. Let's move on to the next step. There's the PaaS posse. I like that rhyme that I made. So platform as a service. I think in many ways the two most famous names are the names at the top, Heroku and Google App Engine. Heroku is a pretty solid product if you're deploying web apps that are based off scripting languages like Ruby or Python or Node. They do PHP. I don't know anybody who's running PHP off Heroku. Google App Engine is great if the app you are building looks like Gmail. Windows Azure, the people I know who use it seem to really like it. It has surprised me over the past 5 years, not even 5 years, let's say the past like 2.5 to 3 years, where ever since Satya has come to the helm, suddenly Windows is an open source friendly company. This is kind of weird, I think, to a lot of us, but I think they're doing great work, so go them. And then Amazon Web Services, because they want to own the entire internet, has their little suite of services that's like, yeah, we're like Heroku, you should use us instead of Heroku. Again, not my bag of tricks. So I've hosted a lot of apps on Heroku. We're going to talk about how ContactOtter relates to Heroku in a little bit, but these aren't even the whole space. These are just the big players in the platform as a service space. And then there's kind of the cool new stuff, which I call assisted self-hosting. Any web app that exists could be hosted on hardware you own if you could download the source and set it up and all that sort of thing. And that would be self-hosting because you've chosen a hosting provider like maybe a DigitalOcean box, or maybe you actually are running a server in your house or at your office, and you just like install it and run it and you do all the configuration and all that. But there's a couple of providers that have come up recently that I call assisted self-hosting because they provide a layer that can be run either on your infrastructure or on theirs that takes care of a lot of the ops stuff for you. You install their package, and then they provide you with easy installers for a lot of the open source apps that you want to use. I think the two big players in this space are Sandstorm and Host. They both do, yeah, I know. They both do roughly the same thing. The primary difference being that Host is aiming like straight at the hobbyist market, the hobbyist self-hosting market. Like they don't seem to have any sort of long-term business strategy. Whereas Sandstorm, maybe I said that wrong. Sandstorm very much wants to be they're committed to supporting the self-hosting market, but they also very much want to be the company that you use to power your intranet with open source apps. So you have a Sandstorm instance at your office, and then you're running these sandboxed open source apps that users at your company can use, and it's completely like isolated and secure and all that kind of stuff. Effectively, what they're doing, both of these, is providing a layer for you to run web apps in isolated containers so you don't have to worry about setting up multiple virtual hosts or whatever on your Apache or Nginx config. You can just deploy a little tiny application bundle to each of these and not have to worry about it. So ContactOtter runs on Heroku, and I also publish a package on Sandstorm. Doing two of these is more work, and we're going to go into why I chose to do two of them. But we'll start with saying, why Sandstorm? And there's a bunch of reasons for this. For me, partially it's because I know people there. A friend of mine, I get to do this thing. So I have a trend that I've noticed, let's say, where no matter what conference I'm at, I can ask a question and see at least one hand go up. So I'm going to ask this question now. Who in this room knows Ashish Laroya? Wow. That's amazing. Okay, this broke my rule. You don't count. I'm sorry. So anyways, I have a friend who works for Sandstorm. They are I like their attitude towards the problem of hosting. They're very customer first, in that they think that the privacy and security of the customers, the people using their apps, should be the most important consideration when building software for Sandstorm. And that's to the point where sometimes it's a little harder to develop for Sandstorm because they want you to be incredibly isolated. They want a Sandstorm app to eventually get to the point where it's not making any external network requests. It's not requesting any external static assets. The entire thing is self-contained, and they can basically build a perimeter, both back-end and front-end, around the Sandstorm app and provide as close to absolute security as they can for their users. So that's kind of amazing, but if you've built web apps, you can kind of probably picture that sounds really annoying for developers. I'm not going to say that's not true. What I'm going to say is those kind of considerations are probably things that you should be thinking about when developing web apps anyways. Do you need to be requesting resources remotely? Do you need to be making that remote network request? Can you find ways to make your app work even when you don't have that capability? Like, if the remote asset that you're requesting is on a server that goes down, well, how does your app handle that gracefully? And those are considerations that actually make developing for Sandstorm help you build these kind of walls around making sure your app works well. Some ways that Sandstorm describes themselves are they're kind of like Google Docs for web apps, where you have instances of web apps, and then you allow users to have either edit or access or whatever kind of permission you want to that instance. So as an example, on Sandstorm, there is an admin, and there is a view, and there is an edit. The idea being that you have an admin that has full control, and the view can just like view contacts, and the edit can edit contacts. And the other thing I like about Sandstorm, as compared to Host, is they have a plan. It's a rough plan, but they have a plan to allow people to actually pay developers on their app store for like long-term support contracts or better features. So they're trying to build in a model where you can have an open source app but get paid for it. And that sounds really interesting, because if you don't want to be a Saas, and we'll talk about that when we talk about Heroku, getting paid sounds nice. So if you're going to be doing this route of deploying on Sandstorm, it really helps to think about this early, because you need to think about, well, what happens if I am blocked from doing external network requests? And external network requests also includes your app sending email, right? Because you have to connect to an email server or send a remote connection. So how do I work around that? How do I make sure my app works when I can't send email or can't request something from a third party? They do have mechanisms for allowing API calls in and allowing some things out, but it's trickier, and you have to think about that. For Django, I highly recommend django-sandstorm, which is a package I wrote to help me put ContactOtter onto Sandstorm. And really all this is doing, it's very simple. Well, it's not necessarily simple. I think it's not complex code in that it's not adding a bunch of features. It's making the Sandstorm user model work with the Django app. That's what it's doing. And Sandstorm also has massive help communities and an IRC channel, and the guy I know who's in charge of community management is really dedicated to making sure it's easy to use for developers and for end users. Okay, so there is a ContactOtter Sandstorm package. ContactOtter also lives on Heroku. And Heroku may seem like a weird choice if you've done any work with platform as a service stuff before, because it has some very strange limiting factors. There's no local storage. There's limited shell access. It's got a strange pricing model. What the hell is a dyno? And it has limited cron, right? Like you can only run a job at most every 10 minutes or something like that. And that maybe or maybe not counts against your pricing. It's weird. And so the thing that I'll say is that it used to be DigitalOcean. ContactOtter started as an app on DigitalOcean, and I'd written some deploy scripts, and it was running behind Nginx on UWSGI with some workers and all sorts of things. And then I noticed that, I'll tell you the real story. I use on another web app called requires.io that monitors the requirements.txt in a Python package and lets you know, hey, these package requirements are out of date, which is something I recommend for any app that you have. Have some piece of software that tells you, hey, your requirements are out of date. And so I went, great. and I went to go log into my server and update the requirements and do some like testing to make sure that the requirements, upgrading the requirements wouldn't break my app on production. And when I went to upgrade the requirements, I broke my virtual env in a way that I still don't understand, and my entire site went down. And I went, well, this is now more ops than I as a developer want to be doing to launch this web app. Let's look at other hosting providers. And so DigitalOcean is great if you have the interest or time to do ops. I don't. I went with Heroku. So the reason I went with Heroku, dirt simple deploys and rollbacks, right? You do a git push, it deploys the app. If that breaks, you click a button and it rolls back to the previous state. I've never had downtime from this. There's lots of great documentation around the product. There's a really good plugin system. And at the end of the day, it's peace of mind. I know that there's something that's like keeping track of my app for me, and that they've got lots of people working on this to make sure that my app stays up. Now, this is kind of a strange case in that Sandstorm is a completely open source project. Heroku is very much not. And so there's something that you might have to reconcile with yourself if you want to have a completely open source stack of, are you okay running your app on a non-open source platform? I'm okay with it. Not everybody may be. And I think the trick there is if you want to run your app on a completely open source platform, then you're probably going to have to be comfortable with more ops than you might want to be doing. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, now we deploy, right? Why almost? If you work in or around web tech, you probably have an ops team. If you work in or around web tech professionally. Maybe you are that ops team. I'm betting a lot of people here are that ops team. The thing that is true for every ops team that I've seen is that they are always being woken up or paged at odd times because of weird failures. I am a development team of 1. I also have a full-time job. I'd really rather not be woken up at 3 a.m. because my hobby app went down. So how do I solve this? I also call this the fear of unknown crashes. First fear was fear of deployment. This is the fear of unknown crashes. And really the question for me is, how do I sleep better? How do I set up things around my app and set up my app so that I can worry less about it being live out in the world? Because the thing about web apps, even if they're running through Sandstorm, is that they are theoretically live 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and every second of every minute of those hours is a potential for the web app to crash and you to get paged or your users to be unhappy and you don't know why. So anything you can do to help yourself here is going to pay really well in the long term. So the first one is really good logging. I think you should start with the idea of over-logging, and then if it's too much of a flood, scale down. But there is nothing that I have discovered more annoying than seeing your system crashed and you have no reason why. You have no idea why. You look at the limited logs on Heroku or on Sandstorm or even on like DigitalOcean and you're like, what's happening? So log every aspect of your product that you think could go wrong. Log the parts of your product that you think couldn't possibly ever go wrong. That's where the crash will be. This ties into good internal error handling. You want to make sure that you are, especially if Python, out of curiosity, how many people are loose Python developers? Know Python. Hey, great, okay. You should try accept everything that can be try accepted and make sure that your exception case is doing something nice, like reporting to Sentry or just like displaying a more helpful error message or logging the exception to a log file. But this mechanism of trying and accepting also exists in JavaScript and also exists in Java and also exists in Ruby. If you think an operation could possibly fail, you should not let that failure trickle all the way up to the user because it's a really bad experience for them and for you. Good external error handling, especially if you are a small team that doesn't have a support department, because who has a support department? And especially if you are dedicated to making your app better, you should make it easy-ish as possible for your users to tell you, hey, this went wrong. For me, this means that at the bottom of each ContactOtter page, there's a link to a Google form where they can say, hey, here's some feedback. Hey, here's what went wrong. There are hundreds of startups that will sell you a widget you can put on your website to do this as well, but I think the Google form thing works pretty well. Having an email address on your app somewhere also helps. You can also have a link directly to GitHub issues, especially since GitHub and GitLab, GitLab had it first, so go GitLab. But GitHub and GitLab now have issue templates, so you can like have a nicely formatted error report from your users, and that's really great. Okay, hopefully this one is also, with good logging, hopefully this one is also fairly well known at this point, but write tests for everything. There's a book that I highly recommend called 2 Scoops of Django, where a guy named Danny Greenfield talks about playing the test coverage game. And the way you play the test coverage game is you have a coverage runner for your tests, and the game is you try to get to as close to 100 as possible. And if any code commit takes you under where you were before, then you're failing the game and you need to go fix that. You want to win the game, and winning the game is 100% test coverage. You will sleep better. Your app deploys will go easier. Do beta tests. Friends and family are really good beta testers. If they're not sick of you asking, hey, can you try this app out for me? Yeah, you might not be trying hard enough. You can also find online communities of people who are interested in this problem. Or you go to conferences and you say, hey, I have this really cool contact manager app. You want to try it out, right? Related to beta tests, staging servers. This is also probably like 30% why I use Heroku. Heroku makes it incredibly easy to have staging servers and then deploy not from your master branch, but deploy from the staging server. So you do a git push to your staging server, you test it out there, hopefully you've already run test, but you test it out there, you see, okay, great, everything still works, and then you just push a button and it copies the blob from your staging server, puts it on production, and you know you've got a solid production build already. What I just talked about is totally doable on your own hardware, say if you're using DigitalOcean or something. But again, that's a lot of ops, and if you don't have the ops resources to make that happen, I'm okay using a platform that has made that happen for me. Using a test runner or a continuous integration solution, I think Travis is a pretty solid kind of like accepted standard in a lot of open source communities right now. I use Travis. The cool thing about Travis and pretty much any continuous integration solution is it can deploy to a server for you. So as an example, the ContactOtter flow is when I think I'm ready to go, I push to master. Travis runs tests against the master branch, deploys to staging. I go check out staging to make sure I haven't broken anything too badly. And then if I think staging is great, tests have already passed, then I deploy to production from staging, and I feel pretty confident that no weird unknown bugs are going to pop up during the operation of my web app. Quickly running out of time. So this is kind of more advanced level stuff, but stuff that I find really helpful for, again, optimizing me having sleep. App metrics, log aggregation, mail hosting providers, and using Git. There are open source solutions for all of these. Those are really great. I use non-open source solutions because most of the open source solutions, again, require having somebody to set up, say, like the alternative for app metrics might be setting up a Grafana server, but you need somebody to set that up for you. The alternative to log aggregation might be an ELK stack, but you need somebody to set that up for you. The alternative, right, it just keeps going, right? So my personal preference is that I've chosen to use non-open source companies to help me deploy my open source web app, and I sleep pretty well at night, actually. Opbeat is great for application tracking. Loggly, there's a lot of alternatives out there. Again, all of these have multiple alternatives. There's no real alternative for Git, unless you want to make a mercurial argument, but we'll be here all day. Was there anything I was going to say about that? Okay, so we're going to wrap up with, but again, this is advanced stuff, but it does help you sleep better. It really helps you sleep better. Oh, fun story about Opbeat, real quick. A friend of mine said, hey, can you build me a Slack / command so that I can do something in a Slack instance that I have? And I said, sure, yeah, let me whip that together for you. And I whipped him up a little / command, threw it on Heroku. He installed it into his Slack. But because Opbeat is so easy to integrate into Python apps, I threw Opbeat on there as well. And then a couple days ago, I got a notification from Opbeat saying, hey, this error has happened. Here's where it's happening. Here is like the link to GitHub for the code where we think it's happening. And so time between Opbeat sending me a notification and me having a fix deployed in production was about 10 minutes. Like, That's amazing. So I highly recommend using stuff like this. Okay, fear of not having fun. This, I think, is a really big one, not just kind of generally in tech, but also especially in open source communities. There's been a lot of really great discussion in the past year plus about burnout. Burnout is a real thing. Burnout is a real thing that happens in all sorts of open source communities. It happens in your work, and it can happen especially with things that are your own ideas, because you could, like, you're putting everything of yourself into this idea, and if it doesn't work the way you want, it's really easy to get burned out about that. And so the subtitle for this section is why self-hosting and SaaSing is a superpower. My plan for ContactOtter, because I've had this work with other apps in the past and it's really helped me not have this fear, is that for my app, it should be easy to come and it should be easy to go. If you get to a point, let's say you're hosting a web app online and you're like, man, I'm tired of dealing with the hosting, I'm tired of dealing with updates, I'm tired of dealing with just like this whole bundle, I am not having fun anymore. But you have a self-hosting option. What you can tell your users so that they're not just completely left in the lurch is, hey, I can't keep this up anymore. But here, you can download all your data as JSON and import it into this self-hosted version, so you're not losing anything. You still have access to your data. It still is usable to you. I just can't host it anymore. And so this is the shield against the fear of not having fun, is make it so that you can gracefully step away from your project, step away from your app, shut it down, but your users aren't left in the lurch. Because if you just one day if you just get to the point where you're burned out, and you just shut it down one day, and your users are left with nothing, you're going to feel worse, right? You're not going to feel better about leaving all your users in the lurch.
Have you taken that path?
Oh, so for the Cards Against Humanity thing I built, I did just shut that down, and I did kind of let the users know, but there wasn't any data there. So this is a path that I have seen taken with some apps. I have taken it in some apps that I can't talk about because they weren't open source, but it's a path that is half implemented in ContactOtter, and the second half will be coming probably over the next week or so. As in, like, right now on ContactOtter, you can get a complete dump of all of your data as a JSON file. I just need to write the bit to actually import it so that you can move to another form. But I do not believe, I believe that lock-in should come from you having the best features, not you, like, tightly holding on to your users' data. Users should stay with you because you've got the best feature set and the best support, not because they can't get their data out of your system. It's their data. It belongs to them. Okay, so we've solved 3 fears. Breathe easy. You will survive. It's going to be fun. I think web apps are still fun. I've been doing it for quite a while. And ask questions. Thanks. Totally will take questions if anybody has any. If not, that's fine. You also come to me afterwards, especially if you're interested in working for a pretty fun event startup in San Francisco. Yeah, hi.
Here's another fear, but how do you deal with your legal nonsense and putting something out there, specifically taking users' information?
Yeah.
Do you download a template that says, here's my EULA? Cool.
So I do link at the bottom of ContactOtter to a policies page, and the policies page right now says use at your own risk. When I get to the point where I'm actually taking money, which is a thing that I hope to do sometime sooner rather than later, then I will get more formal about it, and that becomes, then you have to kind of look at, well, what are the rules for taking money in my state? What are the rules for a business in my state? You don't want to be taking money as you, because then you're personally liable. You want to be taking money as a corporation, because then the corporation is liable, and you can go, aha, that's not me. So that's something to be mindful of. Yeah, hi, in the back.
So, obviously a lot of people end up using MySQL as their database engine.
Sure.
What have you seen, from these kind of not huge web scale apps, but what have you found is a good database engine, and have you tried a couple of places?
Yeah, I've tried a couple. I personally think that it really does depend on what your hosting platform is. Like if you're doing Amazon AWS and you don't have specific requirements for a certain database type, then use RDS because they give it to you for free and you don't have to do a lot of setup. Well, free. Because I'm on Heroku, my backend on Heroku is Postgres because they've got a nice tight integration with Postgres with a lovely little dashboard that I can see how the Postgres database is performing. And so I think that's a really platform-specific question. For Sandstorm, because I'm not expecting like web scale because it's self-hosting, it's just the default Django SQLite backend. It's not doing anything special. I don't need to actually spin up a Postgres or MySQL instance in the Sandstorm server just to host this thing. Other questions? Yeah.
So do you have any issues running Django in a modern web environment?
The question was, man, I've totally forgot to repeat the questions. I feel bad for the recording now. The question was, do I have any problems running Django in a modern web environment? Was that
like Ajax and...
Sure. I actually don't. I think that Django handles Ajax real well. There are some things that Django doesn't handle well up until about a week and a half from now. And the reason I say that is because traditionally the thing that people have complained about Django not being good enough at is that it's not real time, right? You can't do like event-driven stuff. You can't do WebSockets. Aha, but now you can because there's a project that is going to land in Django sometime this year called Channels, which you can use as an optional package for Django now, and it gives you real-time support in Django. You can do WebSockets requests. It gives you like a background task runner asynchronously. It'll also handle web requests more efficiently. It brings real time to Django natively, and it works really well. In fact, ContactOtter on the Heroku version, I haven't done this for the Sandstorm version because it doesn't really need to be that way. ContactOtter for the Heroku version uses channels for all its email sending. So I don't have to have a separate like task server, like a Celery server or whatever. It's all the same server, but it's just firing asynchronous email sending tasks through channels, and it works well. Other questions? If not, you'll get 2 minutes of your life back. Yes?
So when you say you have a Heroku version and a Sandstorm version,
yeah.
So if I go to your ContactOtter URL right now, what am I going to see, and what part of that is Heroku, and what part of that is Sandstorm, and how do they relate? Sure. That's an excellent question. The way that they relate is it's all the same code base. If you go to ContactOtter.com, what you are seeing a web application powered by Heroku. If you have a Sandstorm instance, either because they offer hosting, they'll give you hosting on their servers, or you've got a self-hosted Sandstorm instance, you'll go to their app marketplace and you'll see, hey, cool, ContactOtter has an app on the Sandstorm marketplace. And if you install that ContactOtter app, you'll be running the same code as the Heroku app, but you'll be running it on Sandstorm, either on their infrastructure or self-hosted. And so that's why I think it's like the superpower of doing both is that the code base changes for supporting both don't turn out to be that much. It's mostly, there are some things you can't do in Sandstorm easily, so it's kind of like just turning some features off. So if you have like a feature flagging system, or if you have just like flags in your settings, I found it pretty straightforward, but I'm happy to talk about that as well. All right, great. Thank you so much. You've been a great audience.